C.B. Cooper. The Daughter. Part 1. June 1865. She walked among the dead and dying, the smell of death hanging heavy in the air. In the distance, lightning lit the sky, turning the dark approaching clouds an angry purple. The light breeze picked up and blew a small gust of wind that held the promise of more to come with the approaching electrical storm. She studied the faces of the men laying scattered about, until she finally found the one she was looking for. His face swam to the surface of her memory, a bit murky and a little out of focus, but she was sure it was him. It was the scar that she hadn't forgotten. The purple, puckered flesh that ran from the corner of his left eye down to the tip of his chin. He sat with his back against a log, bent over, clutching his swollen distended stomach, like a woman in the throes of labor. He was too focused on his own pain to notice the stranger that walked among them, until a swift kick to the bottom of his boot got his attention. Looking up through blurry, anguished eyes, he tried to focus on the figure before him. The dark figure loomed before the dying firelight, dressed all in black from head to toe, the face, hidden in the shadow of a black Stetson, pulled low, where it met the upturned collar of the black trail duster. Maybe it was the way it stood, but something about it felt menacing. Whoever it was, they weren't speaking, just watching him, waiting for something. He tried to swallow, but his throat was so dry it felt like his tongue had turned to dust in his mouth. Grabbing the canteen next to him, he raised it to his parched lips. Empty. He threw the vessel back down in angry despair. Never in his life had he felt pain like this. Hell, he'd been shot, more than once, in his life. He'd been stabbed in the gut and slashed in the face by a disgruntled Cajun whore up along the banks of the Mississippi. He'd even had his leg and some ribs busted by a damn loco horse. In those cases, revenge had always made him feel better. He'd killed all the men who had managed to get a shot off first. One man he tracked across 3 states before he caught up with the sorry some bitch. The whore had gotten her just deserts when he'd wrestled the knife away from her, slashed her throat, and then fucked her hard, as her life ebbed from her body. But, he had always held a soft spot for animals, so a well-placed bullet had ended it fast for the horse. None of those things had caused him even 1/10 of the pain he was feeling now. Slowly he closed his eyes and willed his body to surrender. A bucket full of cold water jerked him back from the refuge he so desperately sought. "Wake up," the eerie voice echoed through his head. Coming to, he tried once again to focus on the person before him. "Help me," he managed to moan. "I'll help you, if you tell me what I want to know." The words seemed to be coming from the person in front of him, but they echoed in his head, as if coming from inside a long tunnel, and it sounded almost feminine. Shaking his head, he tried to clear away some of the fog, as well as some of the water. "What is it you want to know? You rode with Jarvis and Adams. Where are they?" His body was suddenly racked with the pain of 1,000 knives being buried deep into his stomach. Screaming out in pain, he fought the urge to vomit. The last time he'd done that, it was nothing but big pools of gelatinous blood and something that looked suspiciously like stomach tissue. The dark figure waited patiently for him to answer the question. When he was finally able to speak again, he cried, "You'll help me." "You have my word," it growled. "They split the group," he croaked. His answer was punctuated with groans and gasps. "Half went with Jarvis, up to a place called Idaho, wants to start a damn town. Adams, to Oregon, I think, he's going to build a town too. Stupid bastards, think they're gonna be kings, or something. And me? I was heading down to OL Mexico. For I got waylaid, that is." Squinting, he tried to make out a face in the one before him. "Who are you?" The figure seemed to ponder the question before answering. Dark and murky came the reply. "Angel." "Angel, huh?" He smiled hopefully, through the tears and pain. "Angel of mercy, I hope." "No. "Angel of death," the figure said, and turned to leave. Panicking, he cried to the retreating shadow, "Wait. You said you'd help me." The figure stopped and turned at his words. Striding back towards him, the long black duster was thrown open with a snap. The wind that had suddenly sprung up, caught the edges and billowed them out, lending them the look of dark leathery wings, like some evil creature sent straight from the devil himself. "I'll help you." The leg was brought straight back, then it swung forward, driving the pointy toe of her boot into the white quivering mass around his belly. "Find your way to hell." Two things happened at once. A black gooey substance shot out of his mouth, and his distended belly quivered, then split open, like a buffalo bladder full of water, spilling its vile contents out onto the ground. The outlaw's mouth opened and shut a few times, before he slumped sideways and hit the dirt, already dead. Directly above, lightning cracked and thunder boomed, rolling and rumbling in protest. Lifting her face to the dark boiling sky, she yelled above the harsh wind, "Vengeance is mine, saith the daughter." Turning, she walked to the edge of the camp and scanned the area that lay beyond, until she found the spot she was looking for. Earlier, after the men had made camp, they had nearly ran for the cooling waters of the deep slow-moving creek, leaving their camp blissfully unattended, finally giving her the chance to work her magic. Later, all the men had returned to camp, except one. He had fallen asleep in the shade of a giant sycamore tree, and now he was back, watching from the cover of the trees. The screams and cries of the heavily poisoned men would have alerted him to the danger before he reached camp. Inhaling deeply, she imagined she could almost smell his fear. Discovering that all 8 of the hard cases you rode with were wiped out by a single stranger, could probably do that to a person. "I know you're out there," she called loud enough to be heard above the storm. "I'm letting you live so you can deliver a message. You tell Jarvis and Adams, I'm coming for them." She looked down as she felt the hand tug on her foot. "Help me," the dying outlaw begged weakly. Lightning flashed, and in that split second, the man recognized her as the girl they had left for dead. Frantically, he clawed for the gun on his hip. Fuck, he cussed, his voice strangled with fright. Pulling her own gun, she smiled at the look of pure fear in the outlaw's eyes. Bringing her boot down, she stomped on the hand that grasped the pistol, crunching the bones in the outlaw's hands with the heel of her boot. He screamed in pain and outrage. Towing the weapon away, she knelt down and shoved the cold steel of the gun barrel under his chin. Another bright flash revealed her black, soulless eyes. "No, fuck you." Pulling the trigger, the bullet entered the fleshy underside of his chin, then exploded out the top of his head, scattering bits of bone, blood, and brain matter about. Standing, she turned her attention back to the tree line and shouted above the howling wind, "You tell em I'm coming. I'm coming and I'm bringing hell with me." May 1865. The soldier squatted on his haunches, peering intently at the small, but well-kept cabin across the field from the stand of trees that hid him. It was barely breaking daylight when the door opened and a girl walked out. He studied her form as she headed across the yard to the barn where the animals were kept. She appeared to be 16, maybe 17 years old. She walked, not with the carefree bounce that so many girls of her age had, but with long purposeful strides. She wore denim breeches and a cotton work shirt. Her long dark curly hair was pulled back on the sides in a clip of some sort, the rest left free to cascade down her back. As she pulled the barn door open, he noticed with a frown, that she also wore a gun, holstered and hanging from her trim hip. The soldier waited for what seemed like an eternity for her to re-emerge from the barn. In that time he imagined her inside going about her daily chores. Feeding the animals, taking the time to stop and talk to them. Inspecting each with an ever-watchful eye, always on the lookout for injury or illness. He turned his attention back to the house. He could see a faint light that had been left burning, setting the inside of the cabin aglow. He watched the muted light within, looking for any change in light or shadow that would alert him to someone else's presence. He saw none. Loud squealing from the barn drew his attention. Hogs, weanlings from the sounds of it, fighting over slop. As the sound diminished, he pictured them quieting down, all lined up in a row, their curly tails wiggling in their excitement, doing their best to get as much as they could before it was gone. A few minutes later the girl re-emerged. Watching her walk back across the yard to the cabin, he felt his heart constrict with longing. Unconsciously, his fingers reached out, hesitantly, as if he could touch her from this distance. All too quickly she disappeared back into the house. He sat where he was and wrestled with his options. One part of him wanted to walk across the field and claim what was rightfully his, the other told him to cut and run. He sat pondering that very idea, when a gun barrel nudged him in the back. He froze for half a second, then grinning to himself, he shook his head. "Hello, Gracie." Ben Walker stood slowly and turned to face the beautiful dark-haired girl behind him. "Daddy." Grinning at her with sad eyes, he said, "It's been a long time, angel girl. I see you haven't lost your touch any." For as long as he could remember, she'd had the ability to sense when someone was coming. Same as she always knew where something was hiding, animal or human. Her older brother Luke hated playing hide and seek with her when they were little. She'd hide her eyes and count, and no matter how far he went, or how good he hid, when she was done counting, she would walk right to wherever he'd been hiding. Damnedest thing he'd ever seen. Finally, over the initial shock, Gracie smiled back, "Been wondering when you were gonna show up, and then, it's good to have you home, Daddy." Ben took a step forward and pulled his daughter into an awkward embrace. She sure had grown in the 4 years he'd been gone. Hardly seemed like his little girl anymore. "It's good to be home, angel girl," he said, using the nickname he'd called her since the first time she'd smiled up at him from the cradle. Frowning, he realized the endearment didn't roll quite as easily off his tongue like it used to. Too much time had passed. Damn war. Stepping back, he pasted on a bright smile, clapping her on the shoulder. "How about we head on up to the house? You got any coffee for an old broke-down rebel soldier?" "You bet, pots on the stove," she said. "How's a breakfast of bacon and eggs sound?" Hobbling along as best he could over the uneven ground, he answered, "Sounds like heaven, angel girl. Sounds like pure heaven." After Ben's belly was stuffed full, fuller than it had been in a long time, he limped out onto the porch and eased himself into one of the chairs. As he rolled a cigarette he asked the question he hadn't wanted to ask. "I seen a grave over yonder, in the trees. That be your ma or your brother?" Gracie sat in the chair next to him and sighed. She hadn't been looking forward to answering the question any more than he'd been wanting to ask it. "That'd be Mama. She took sick the winter after you left." Smiling sadly, she added, "She held on for as long as she could. She made it as far as the next spring, purely out of stubbornness, I suppose." "That right," he said, striking a match and touching it to the tip of his cigarette. "Oh yeah, she hung on, fighting it till the very last, she did. Couldn't tell ya why." Turning his head to the side, Ben spat out a piece of loose tobacco. "You take care of her all by yourself?" "Yes, sir." Well, that would explain it in Ben's mind. The evil woman probably held on as long as she could just to make Gracie's life a living hell for a tad bit longer. Ben had met and married Loretta James back in '46. She'd hailed from up in Missouri and he'd met her while attending a social function with his uncle. He'd thought she was the prettiest girl he'd ever laid eyes on. That night they had danced to every song the band had played, all under the watchful eyes of her kin. Ben didn't know until later, that there was a reason no one else was asking the dark-haired beauty to dance. Seems her kin was from rough stock, and they didn't take real kindly to men messing with their womenfolk. Not that they had much to worry about, seeing how most of their women were ugly as sin, all except Loretta. But Ben, not being from around those parts, had no idea the trouble he was bringing upon himself. That is, until he took a trip out back to relieve himself later that night. The whole dance had went dead silent as he made his way slowly back through the crowd, back to his Loretta. He'd been beaten black and blue. One eye was completely swelled shut, the other was on its way. His lip was split wide open, and his nose was growing by the second. When he was just feet from reaching his goal, her pa had stepped in between them. Earl James was a big, ugly, mean son of a bitch. He glared down at Ben for a long minute, then he asked him, "Are you stubborn, or just plain stupid, boy?" Ben had stood there thinking about it, and finally answered with a cocky half-grin, "I'd say a little of both, I reckon. Now, if you'll excuse me, that pretty little gal behind you is waiting to dance." Audible gasps had went up around the crowd. Mothers had covered their young UNS eyes, men put protective hands on their womenfolk, ready to shield them from danger if need be. Everyone was froze like statues, waiting to see the dumb Arkansas boy ripped apart by the James men. But Ben had just stood there, grinning at the huge hulk of a man, and no one was as surprised as Ben was, when Earl James finally shook his head and started laughing, long and loud. Slapping him on the shoulder he'd said, "You got sand, boy, I'll give ya that." Then to the band he'd yelled, "Strike up the music, boys, my daughter wants to dance." There had been many times over the years that followed that Ben had wished Earl would have shown him some mercy, and just killed him on the spot. It turned out that Loretta James was twice as ugly on the inside as she had been beautiful on the outside. Gracie interrupted his thoughts, "How'd you get that limp, Daddy?" "Never you mind about that right now. Where's your brother, Gracie?" Looking out over the field, she sighed, "Gone. I ran him off right after Mama died. Him and that no-account Billy Weaver think they're startin' a gang of some sort. Luke thought that this would be a good hideout for them. I had to convince him otherwise. Figures. That damn kid might have came from Ben's loins, but his ma had ruined him to the quick. Turned him into an arrogant, self-centered, lazy little bastard. His being gone weren't no cause for grief, that was for damn sure. Loretta had treated that kid like he was the second coming of Christ, he could do no wrong in her eyes. But poor little Gracie, she never could do no right. There just weren't no two ways about it. Loretta hated Gracie from the get-go. She had claimed, almost from the time Gracie was born, that she had the devil in her. He and Loretta used to get into horrible fights over the way she treated her. Until, that is, Ben started noticing that Gracie would turn up the next day with terrible bruises. After that, Ben held his tongue and kept his trap shut for over a year. He had walked on eggshells around that woman so she'd have no reason to be mean to Gracie in his absence. Until one night when he returned from the fields and Gracie was nowhere to be seen. He'd kept quiet most of the way through supper, even though he'd been sick with worry at her absence. Loretta and Luke had been downright chipper all through the meal, talking and laughing, as if nothing were amiss. Ben had waited as long as he could, till he couldn't stand it no more. Finally, he asked Loretta where Gracie was. She didn't feel well, so she went to lay down. She had said, shrugging nonchalantly. But she had gotten panicky real quick when Ben stood up and announced he was going to check on her. Grabbing his arm and pasting on a smile, she had tried to stop him. "She's fine, Ben, sit and finish your supper." When she realized that wasn't working, she jumped up and tried to block his way, and the next words out of her mouth had made his blood run cold. She had laughed, though it sounded strained and tinny to his ears, almost on the edge of hysteria. "My word, Ben, I just don't know what I'm gonna do with that girl. She just insists on being bad. Someone's got to teach her right from wrong." She had shouted the last part to his back, as he shoved past her and strode towards Gracie's bedroom. He walked to the far end of the cabin where two small rooms had been partitioned off for the kids. As he walked through the doorway he could see her laying on her bed, curled up into a little ball beneath the covers. She had looked so small and fragile. He had gently scooped her up, listening to her whimper like a hurt puppy, then sat down on her bed, holding her close to his chest, slowly rocking her back and forth. One side of her face was bruised horribly, her eye was swelled and her lip was split. And those were just the injuries he could see. The way she stayed curled in his arms, told him there were probably far worse injuries under her clothes. He had sat there, fighting the rage that was building inside of him. "I am so sorry, Angel," he had whispered to her. Her little hand had began patting his chest, consoling him. "I's all right, Daddy. I'm okay," she'd mumbled through swollen bloodied lips. Ben had fought to choke back the sob that threatened to escape. It wasn't all right. How could someone do that to a child, and not just any child, but their own child? Flesh and blood. His thoughts had turned murderous as he thought about his depraved wife. God, he wanted to kill her. Just wrap his bare hands around her throat, and choke the wretched life right out of her body. Carefully, he had laid Gracie down and tucked the blanket around her. Then he had went to find Loretta. She had been standing in the kitchen with her back to him. Luke was nowhere to be seen as he crossed the room to the woman he had married, the woman who had bore his babies, the woman who had miserably failed not only him, but also their children. She had heard him coming and spun around, her eyes wild with fear, and a large boning knife gripped firmly in her hands, ready to strike when he got close enough. "She's evil, Ben. You're a stupid blind fool. That girl's got the devil in her. Why don't you see that?" Ben's steps never faltered. He grabbed her slim wrist, squeezing hard as he bent it backwards, feeling the crunch of cartilage beneath his fingers. Then he grabbed the knife with his other hand, and threw it across the room. Next, he cut her off in mid-scream, with a hard right to the mouth. Never in his life had he struck a woman, and he didn't abide by men who did, but he'd also never hated anyone as much as he had hated her right then, and all he had wanted to do was kill her. In a blind rage, he had delivered blow after crushing blow, intent on beating her to death. He'd kept quiet for a whole year, letting all his anger and resentment build up behind the wall he had carefully constructed, but the dam had broken. He was in the midst of unleashing a year's worth of fury on her, but stopped short, as he heard his little girl say, "Daddy." He had looked up to see Gracie, standing by the kitchen table, tears streaming down her bruised, scrunched up face. The look she had given him had broke his heart in two, and turned his rage to shame in an instant. It had seemed to say, "Not you too." Ben cleared his throat. "You've been taking care of this place all by yourself." "No, sir. Reverend Sharp moved into the barn right before Mama died. Got himself a pretty nice little setup out there. He helps out quite a bit when he's here." Ben nodded. He was glad to hear that his old friend was staying here and keeping an eye on the place. He had met Sam Sharp down in Texas, when things were first gearing up for the Mexican-American War. Ben's uncle ran freight for the army, and he had ridden with him on more than one occasion. They'd been sitting in the middle of the army camp when Ben had seen the flap of the general's tent open and a man, just a few years older than himself, walked out. He was young, maybe 18, but he was big. Easily 6 feet tall, he had massive shoulders, slim hips, and long powerful legs. Walking across the encampment, men of all ranks, from soldiers to lieutenants, greeted the man. Some stopping him to have a few words, shake his hand or slap him on the back. It was all too evident, that whoever he was greatly respected by all the men there. His uncle had noticed him watching the man, and told him, "You're looking at a living legend. That there is Sam Sharp." Ben studied him. "How old is he, ya think?" he asked. "Don't rightly know," his uncle had said. Not quite 20 years I think. But age don't matter out here, that boy over yonder's probably one of the fiercest fighters you'll ever come across. Hell, I heard tell he started fighting Comanche as soon as he was old enough to pick up a gun, and even then he had to stand with his back against a tree, just to keep from getting knocked on his butt. Heard he's an expert tracker too. Is he in the army? Nah, Sam wouldn't throw in with them, no matter how much they begged. But, he's here now. Ben pointed out. Yep, of his own free accord. He's what you'd call a free agent I guess. Army's been wanting him to help their fight with the Mexicans, seems maybe they done talked him into it. He's got the respect of every man jack around, and with good reason, he earned it. That boy's got some serious sand. Sam Sharp had shown up in town a few years before Ben had left to fight in the war, only now, instead of packing his customary arsenal of weapons, he was toting a Bible, and calling himself Reverend Sharp. Ben had about fell over. Guns and knives can fight all sorts of human foe, but only the Bible can fight against a man's demons. Sam had told him when Ben asked him about the sudden change in professions. That had been the only time they had spoken of it. Ben stared out into the half-plowed field and felt a stab of remorse. He'd only been home a few hours and already the list of things that needed doing on the farm was overwhelming. Fields needed plowed and planted, there were fences falling down all over the place, and he'd seen 3 drip pans in the main room of the cabin alone. And he'd come home a goddamn cripple. The doctor who treated him had painted a grim picture of his future. The bullet had hit him in the hip and lodged in the bone. The doc had called it the invisible war souvenir. He had said, "You're not gonna be able to see it, but you're sure the hell gonna feel it." Ben had felt like shooting him for his bedside manner alone. He delivered bad news with all the excitement of a demented peddler, hawking his wares. "Congratulations," he'd told the man in the bed next to him, "you made it through the war, son. You're gonna get to go home. Only your legs aren't going with ya." Ha ha ha. He was a sick man. He liked to brag that he could saw off a man's leg in 43 seconds flat, but somewhere he'd heard a rumor that another army doctor could do it in 40, a time he had been trying fiercely to beat. Absently, Ben rubbed the top of his bad leg, at least it was still there. Looking over at his daughter he said, "Gracie, this farm is fallen down around your ears, and I'm afraid I ain't gonna be nothing but a burden to you." Seeing the flash of anger and hurt in her eyes, he quickly added, "I knowed you tried your best, no one sayin' that ya didn't, but a fact is a fact, angel girl. So, I been thinking, is Mr. Stanley still trying to buy this place?" Gracie jumped up and faced him. She was furious. "I don't care what you've been thinking. Now, I'm glad you're home, Daddy, but let's you and me get one thing straight right now. I've been taking care of this place for the last 4 years, and I'll be damned if I'm gonna let you waltz in here and start telling me what you think. I've worked my fingers to the bone and until my back's nearly broke, and if it's not good enough for you, then you can just leave." Ben regarded her with amusement. "I see you found your tongue while I was away." The fact that he found all this funny, just infuriated her even more. "And if you think you're just gonna sit in that goddamn chair all day and have me wait on you hand and foot, you got another thing coming. If you're gonna stay on my farm, then you're gonna work. There's plenty of things around here you can do. The whole damn barn's full of busted riggin', busted tools, axes that need new handles and their blades sharpened. There's an endless number of things you can do right from that chair, but if you're not willin', then grab up your war bag and get on down the road." Ben couldn't believe his ears. "Why, you little smart aleck," he yelled as he watched her stomp down the dilapidated stairs. The last one broke under her weight, almost pitching her onto her butt. Pointing at the broken, splintered piece of wood, she yelled, "That can be your first project." Ben stood, his breath hissing sharply as the pain shot down his leg. "This is my farm, Missy. And I'd thank you kindly to remember it, he yelled at her, retreating back. Watching her stomp across the yard, the anger started to subside, and he found himself chuckling, "I'll be goddamned, if and she ain't just like me after all." He found her out in the barn hooking up the yoke and traces to the big Missouri mule. Limping up behind her, he said, "I'm sorry Gracie, I didn't mean to imply you haven't been doing a good job around here, I know you've done your best." Turning, she looked at him with angry tears shining in her eyes. "You know what, Daddy? Some days I work so hard all I can do is collapse into bed at night, too tired to even eat supper. But you know what? Every morning, I get up, and I do it again. Not once in the last 4 years did I ever give up on this farm. Not once." He looked into her big brown eyes, full of hurt and unshed tears, and felt about 2 inches high. He'd been ready to suggest earlier that they sell the farm, pack it in, and maybe move to a bigger town, and start all over. But seeing her reaction and hearing her words, he'd rather cut out his own tongue than mention such a thing now. And she was right. This was her farm now, bought and paid for by her own blood, sweat, and tears. He could never take that away from her. Slowly he removed the hat from his head and held it in both his hands, nervously flexing the brim. "You're right Gracie, I was feeling sorry for myself back there, and I thank you for setting this fool straight." Gesturing with his hat, he continued, "None of this is your fault, Gracie. I ran off to fight in that damn war and left you here to shoulder my burdens. This farm, your mother, all of it. And that wasn't fair for you. Hell, I wouldn't have blamed you at all if and you'd run away, went out, and made a life for yourself, but you didn't. You stuck it out and you did a damned fine job of it, and I'm proud of you. And you're right, this is your farm, you've more than earned it." "Now," he said smiling, stuffing his hat back on his head and clapping his hands together, "what would you like me to do first, boss?" She stared at him for a moment, then threw her arms around his neck, the added weight almost knocking him off balance. "Thank you, Daddy." Ben squeezed back, and whispered, "Like I said, I'm right proud of you, angel girl, right proud."